Hello and welcome to this video. This video is part of my course Introduction to Telecom and talks about radio band and radio spectrum management. In case you like this video, please subscribe to my channel and I hope you enjoy the content that I create. Alright, so let's get started with the next section, that is radio spectrum management, and in this section we are going to understand the spectrum and the bands. So this is a very small section just to understand what are the radio bands out there and how it is being managed. So let us talk about radio spectrum. So radio spectrum is a part of electromagnetic spectrum with the frequencies from 3 Hz to 3000 GHz or 3 Hz to 3 THz. To prevent interference between different users, the generation and transmission of radio waves is strictly regulated by national laws, coordinated by international body, the ITU, and that's what we talked about in the section where we were talking about ITU. What was the main scope of work for ITU? And one of these main scope of work was international harmonization of frequency bands. Electromagnetic waves of frequencies arbitrarily lower than 3000 GHz propagated in the space without artificial guide. This is the official definition of radio spectrum. So it does not define anything, you can say the lower band. It is only the higher band, that is the 3 terahertz, that is being defined by ITU, and it does not require any artificial guide for the radio waves to propagate in the space. So this is what radio spectrum is. Now radio bands is a small frequency band which is a contiguous section of range of radio spectrum. Now each band can have a separate distinct property and this is used to set aside for the same purpose. So suppose think of the complete bandwidth of radio spectrum from 3 Hz to 3 terahertz, and we have separated small lanes of those bandwidths for a different purpose altogether. Now these bands are created to prevent interference and to allow for the efficient use of radio spectrum. Similar services are allocated in bands. So we will see why these bands classification is important. For example, broadcasting, mobile radio or navigation devices will be allocated in non-overlapping range of frequencies so that there is no interference. Now, if you see the band plan, ITU has a frequency band plan which dictates how it is to be used and shared to avoid interference and to set a protocol for compatibility of transmitter and receiver. And it is also about standardization. So if you see your mobile phone, you will see which bands it supports. Now, this is very important because in US there would be a different bands and in other countries there would be different bands. So it also, helps the manufacturer decide where they want to sell and what bands they need to cover. So each frequency plan defines the frequency range to be included, how channels are to be defined, and what will be carried on those channels. So typical definition of the frequency plan would be numbering scheme, which channel numbers or letters will be assigned. What is the center frequency? So the center frequency would be the part of the frequency which is centered to that block. What is the bandwidth and or deviation? For example, if we take a 20 megahertz block, we can define the center frequency and the bandwidth would be 10 megahertz less than the center frequency and 10 megahertz more than the center frequency. That would be the deviation. And then spectral mask, how extraneous signals will be attenuated by the frequency. What type of modulation can be used on that block, and that's why you see the AM amplitude modulation has a specific block and the frequency modulation has a specific block, and that's what we use in our radio, the FM radio or AM radio devices, right? And then what type of content is allowed? It is suitable for audio, video, analog or digital, and what would be the licensing patterns to obtain that block. So this is all defined in the band plan. So who manages that radio bands? And I've already informed this that ITU is the key body which standardizes these bands and allocates the global radio spectrum depending upon the needs of the countries as well as the region. It also, develops the technical standards to ensure networks and technology seamlessly interconnect. And these standards are pretty important in standardization part of the ITUR. Now let's take a look at the ITU bands. So if we divide the frequency band and the range and what are the primary application. So you can see the ITU bands are very simple to remember. It is very low frequency to extremely high frequency, VLF to EHF. So this is the ITU bands that has been classified. And if we look into detail from VLF to HF, so VLF is basically for LORAN, Omega, frequency navigation, low frequency navigation, and time signals. LF, that is the low frequency. It is 30 kilohertz to 300 kilohertz, and this is for navigation system like non-directional beacons. It is also used for long distance communication for maritime and aeronautical services. Then you have medium frequency, which is maritime distress and safety communication. Example, also used for AM broadcasting. And in this, 535 kilohertz to 1705 kilohertz, the only signal that is allowed is analog with amplitude modulation, and that's why it's called the AM radio broadcasting. Then on the high frequency, we have international shortwave broadcasting, amateur radio, long range aircraft communication, and maritime communication. And if we talk about the very high frequency, ultra high frequency, and super high frequency, you can see very high frequency is public services, two-way land mobile radio, amateur radio, emergency services, FM radio broadcasting, and most of you would be aware of this frequency band, 88 megahertz to 108 megahertz, and there are the few channels that we listen in our home or in our car, for the FM radio. So only signal type that is supported is digital with frequency modulation. Then you have 108 megahertz to 137 megahertz. This is for aeronautical navigation and communication. 137 megahertz to 174 megahertz, weather satellites, land mobile and public safety, and 174 megahertz to 230 megahertz television broadcasting. If we talk about ultra high frequency, this is 300 megahertz to 450 megahertz. This is also for land mobile radio and UHF. Then you have 450 megahertz and 512 megahertz. This is the land mobile services, and you will see there is some band from 960 megahertz to 1.4 gigahertz, which is for GSM LTE radar navigation. 806 megahertz to 960 megahertz, cellular phones, public safety. So this band till 3 gigahertz is now currently being used for mobile communication till 4G. And if we talk about 5G, we also use the super high frequency band, which is somewhat related to around 3 gigahertz to 10 gigahertz. This is for radar, satellite communication, point-to-point, microwave links, etc. And this is pretty important because the super high frequency, the characteristics change. The super high frequency will mostly have a point-to-point link, and that's why it is used for microwave. Then from 10 gigahertz to 30 gigahertz, satellite communication, space research, radar, and backhaul networks. So this is the complete, you can say, characteristics of VHF, UHF, and SHF. Now we talk about EU and NATO. They have a different band characterization, and they denote with the letters like B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L. And the classification starts from 0.01 gigahertz and ends around 60 gigahertz, which is the frequency band L. Similarly, for IEEE, there is a different band, and the band designation is LSC XKU, that is quotes under K, quotes above KA, V, W. And there's a different characteristics about these quotes band, which is basically they are impacted by the clouds. And sometimes what happens, you use the home dish services in this band, and that get impacted when there is a bad weather. So you can see here the millimeter wave radars is in V band, millimeter wave radars future potential for communication is in W band. So these are the band designation in IEEE. So if we do the comparison on the frequency band designation, you can see this is how a complete frequency band designation looks. So EU, NATO, and US ECM, there is a A band, which is from 1 hertz to around 150, or you can see 150 hertz or 300 megahertz. And then you can see there is the other band. And similarly, you have ITU band here and IEEE band here. So this is from Wikipedia. You can go ahead and check this as well. Now, if we talk about international harmonization, so international harmonization of frequency band is a step where all the countries would work out what type of frequency bands they would be using for what type of services. This is to reduce interference, and it also ensure that neighboring countries don't bleed over and cause problems like issues on mobile phone, issues with other sensitive services. It also boosts economies of scale because you can use the similar phone into different countries if it is supporting both the bands, and it also enables roaming because you don't need to use the same bands and have interference and to regulate interference, etc. So the key player, as I mentioned, is ITU, which is a UN agency, and it has conferences every few years, which works on spectrum allocation and technical conditions. So this is the key process in ITUR. Now, if we map the frequency bands on type of services in mobile, you can see the GSM is in from 1 gigahertz to 2 gigahertz almost, and this is in IEEE band E, and you can see it is GSM 900, GSM 1800. We have 5G NR as well, which is into different, you can say split over almost all the bands. We had UMTS 2100 into band F. Then you have LD, you can say into different bands as well. So this is a kind of an example mapping of frequency bands. Now keep in mind, all of these bands are licensed. However, we have some unlicensed bands as well. We call the unlicensed spectra. So licensed is basically allocated by the government, and we know there is a auction of those bands. The spectrum is bought by the mobile operators, and then they are able to operate on those bands. And due to this, interference can be controlled. We can identify who is transmitting on what bands, and we are able to understand what is the frequency pattern or the spectrum pattern there. Similarly, you will have unlicensed band, which is free to use, and this is called the ISM band. So it is industrial, scientific, and medical band for industrial, scientific, and medical purposes. It has some power limitation. You cannot transmit more than certain power. And example bands are 2.4 gigahertz, 5.8 gigahertz, and 60 gigahertz. So the Wi-Fi that you use at your home is in these 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz range. So the example technologies are Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. So that was about the bands and the spectrum. The key takeaways from this section is that frequency spectrum is a key resource which is easily impacted by interference. Mitigation of interference is important, and international harmonization is a global effort to map frequency bands to avoid inter-country interference. Different frequency bands will have different characteristics, and that's why we had created those lanes in that complete road so that those lanes can be specifically allocated to different type of services. And the ISM bands are unlicensed spectrum which can be used for personal use as well. So this was about spectrum and bands, and I will see you in the next section.